Welcome to another episode of Think Development Out Loud. Today we have Dr. Briony Jones and Ulrike Lühe. They will be sharing reflections on their new book, Knowledge for Peace. One of the editors is Dr. Briony Jones, who is an Associate Professor of International Development in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick. She's also Deputy Director of the Warwick Interdisciplinary Research Centre for International Development, WICID. We also have Ulrike Lühe, who is a postdoctoral researcher and program officer at the Dealing with the Past program at Swisspeace, an associated institute of the University of Basel. Ulrike recently concluded her PhD on the development of African Union Transitional Justice policy and the practices of expertise in international relations. Thank you both for joining me. Let's begin by how the idea for this book emerged.
Well, this book is the direct product of a 4-year international research collaboration, which ran from 2016 to 2020 and was funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation and the Swiss Development Corporation. It was a collaboration between the partners of Swisspeace, the University of Juba, and the Swiss Centre for Scientific Research in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. And the project really aims to do two things. Firstly, to analyse how knowledge in transitional justice is produced, how it is legitimised, and also how it's used. And then to secondly, reflect on what this means for the types of policies which are designed and enacted, as well as the research policy practice exchanges. In our project, we have 3 case studies: the African Union, Côte d'Ivoire, and South Sudan. And we undertook qualitative fieldwork for each of these case studies, as well as held a series of dialogue workshops in Switzerland, Côte d'Ivoire, and Uganda with policymakers and practitioners to reflect on the findings of the project and to think about their implications for different types of behaviours and different actors. And really the idea behind the book was to bring the findings from our project into conversation with other case studies and other literatures. So the book itself has 2 key red threads, which each of the chapters speak to a greater or lesser extent. So the first red thread is looking at the interlinkages between the processes and the politics of knowledge production. And the second red thread is looking at the research policy practice nexus. And the book has recently been published and is now online with Edward Elgar, which means it's open access and freely accessible to download. And this was very important to us, we felt, to have an inclusive ethos of knowledge production in terms of the subject matter of our research in the book, and also the way in which we'd approached that subject matter specifically. And the book itself has a wide variety of chapters. Some are more conceptual and engage with, for example, the politics of knowledge and peace building generally, or transitional justice more broadly. And others are much more specific and maybe look at a specific mechanism like a Truth Commission or an organisation such as the African Union, or with a specific country case such as Zimbabwe and Burundi.
The idea of doing a research partnership was, of course, very key to our project. On the one side, we were funded by the Research for Development mechanism, which is focused on transnational research partnerships. But then on the other side, of course, there is the fact that transitional justice has a very strong north-south dynamic with a lot of inequalities shaping these relationships, and north-south partnerships have been proposed as one way of addressing these inequalities. And so we tried in the course of working on this project, but also particularly at the end, to really reflect on how did this partnership work out for us in practice, how did north-south relations shape our work, and how did the partnership also shape how we produce knowledge in this process. And of course, partnerships shape our ideas in different ways, right? So we realized that the original idea for the project, for example, was developed by the partners in Switzerland and the UK, who also wrote the project proposal, were in charge of the management of the project. But of course, throughout the project, our conversations and exchanges and the dialogue workshops that Briony already mentioned also shaped our thinking together as a team. And so sort of ideas develop in and through this partnership idea. But of course, one also has to say that partnerships bring inequalities to the fore, right? So there are partners in Switzerland and the UK who were in charge, as I said, of managing the project. And one of our colleagues from Juba put it very pointedly, talking about Switzerland as a peaceful country where things work with a certain degree of reliability. And you contrast that with South Sudan, where participating in research requires a huge degree of flexibility to meet sort of the uncertainties of politics, but also of everyday life. And so I think one of our key reflections on partnerships is that I think we come into these partnerships with really good intentions, but the practice, of course, has to live up to those good intentions. And there is a lot we can do as researchers ourselves in terms of building trust and working relationships that treat each other as equals. But I think there's also a gap that we need to bridge in ethical ways between the structures and planning required for projectment and the flexibility and uncertainty of the context that we work on when we're talking about transitional justice, for example. Yeah, so there's a lot to continue to unpack there, and our chapter and our own project was the first step in this regard. The book covers different case studies, of course. Briony has already mentioned our conceptual and intellectual red threads that pull through all of the chapters and shape particularly the first 3 or 4 chapters. On the empirical side, we have case studies that focus on the one side of how agenda setting and knowledge production interact and are interlinked with each other and are, of course, shaped by power dynamics. We have chapters on Cote d'Ivoire, Burundi, and Zimbabwe that really show very nicely these north-south dynamics in who is considered sort of an authoritative voice, who gets to shape the agenda on transitional justice in a given context. We also have a set of case studies that focus more on sort of specific actors and processes, the idea of experts and expertise. For example, we have a contribution on that analyzes the members of different truth commissions and looks at the selection criteria for commissioners and ideas of representation and knowledge inherent in that. We also have a chapter on the African Union transitional justice policy that tries to broaden the idea of expertise in transitional justice. So we often talk only about transitional justice experts, and we have very particular institutions and people in mind, but the chapter tries to really open this up a bit and show that we also need political expertise, networks, and all kinds of other expertise in order for a policy process such as the one of the African Union to work and be fruitful. We have chapters on South Sudan, a chapter on South Sudan, for example, that shows the interplay between different actors and how they also manipulate knowledge, for example, by only releasing reports so late in a peace negotiation that they can't have an impact anymore. And we have another chapter on Burundi, which really unpacks the incredibly complex landscape of knowledge, perceptions, partly rumors and framings that shape how a conflict or the conflict in Burundi is understood by different actors, both within and outside of the country. It's nicely framed, the meaning of violence and the violence of meaning. I think that puts it really spot on what the author is discussing.
Two fields of peace building and transitional justice are actually quite normative fields. So they're about how the world should be, what we should do, what peace and justice look like. And so I think it's particularly important to ask questions about why we have certain knowledge and why certain knowledge is seen as being more authoritative than other forms of knowledge or other knowledge emanating from different actors, for example. And posing these questions allows us to reveal the power relations which are at the foundation of shaping and determining the fields. I think additionally, in transitional justice and peace building, there's problematic relationships in terms of the global north and the global south. And too often the knowledge that's used to define and determine the field is seen as emanating from the global north, and particularly from post-Enlightenment rationalities and liberalism. And so if we can focus on the politics of knowledge, this also allows us to interrogate and to unpick this.
If I could just add to that briefly, I think the book is also a first attempt to sort of question and unpack the power of experts. I think experts have become very powerful actors in transitional justice. They can put transitional justice on the agenda or not. They shape what the agenda looks like. They frame and monitor implementation. They can sort of judge the success of transitional justice processes. So they really hold a lot of influence and power in these processes. And yet we haven't really sort of had the conversation and made the effort to understand how do they actually come to be seen as experts? How do they work? What impact do they have? And also what kinds of expertise are we talking about here if we unpack this in more detail? So the book is trying to start that conversation as well.
Some epistemological challenges, I think, in approaching the project, and then throughout the kind of the developing the book and working with the authors as well, because it's quite difficult methodologically to get to what counts as knowledge. In order to do research on knowledge, we have to label certain things as knowledge and other things not as knowledge, which already imbues the research, I think, with a sense of our own biases about what knowledge looks like, what counts as knowledge. So it becomes a sort of a problematic knowledge production circle, as it were. But I think when we set up the project, we had a really diverse and interdisciplinary team. And I think this also goes for the book, which comes out of the project. It's very diverse and interdisciplinary. And this is very helpful because it allows us to work together on developing proxies for knowledge and also in identifying suitable case studies, which would allow us to have relevant insights into the processes which were really at the heart of the knowledge seeking that we were doing together in the project and in the book.